In the late 1800s, people of this area, then known as Becca, yearned for a religious service in their community. On Sunday, March 1st, 1891, the Reverend W. L. Boggs, who was at the time minister of Centerpoint Presbyterian Church, began holding services in the Academy building at Becca. The Academy was located near what is presently Roebuck Elementary School, and while this one-room building cannot be confirmed as the Becca Academy, it is known to have been in this area, and local residents have indicated that it was very similar to this. The Academy burned around 1980. Also during this time, Innery Presbytery employed several evangelists who traveled the countryside, holding meetings and aiding in the organization of new churches. One such evangelist was Reverend N.J. Holmes. He came to Becca to hold a series of meetings, and so much interest was exhibited during this time, he officially organized the church on September the 10th, 1891. The charter members of the church organization were John M. Switzer, Margaret Switzer, Mary J. Switzer, B. Henry Finch, Annie E. Finch, Patrick T. Switzer, David W. Switzer, Iola Switzer, W. J. Wood, and S. Pinckney Miller. John Switzer and W. J. Wood were elected, ordained, and installed as elders, with David Switzer and Henry Finch as deacons. And so, with a unanimous vote, the name was chosen as Becca Presbyterian Church. The following Sunday, several new names were added to the church roll. They were D.C. Strobel, Edward Finch, Minnie Finch, Eleanor Annie Finch, Samuel C. Switzer, James Steddings, Jefferson George, and E.F. Parker. With the small congregation already growing, immediate plans were made for constructing a church building, and the building committee was formed. A building site was chosen, and E.F. Parker and John Switzer purchased the 1-acre lot from Hiram Maccabee for the sum of $20. After Mr. Maccabee found out that the land was purchased to build a church, he returned the money. The wooded lot was cleared, and lumber was made from the felled trees. Construction had begun of the building that we sit in today. Even now, if you were to take a close inspection of the attic rafters, you can still see the bark from the trees that were felled between 1891 and 1893. The newly built church was formally dedicated on Sunday, April the 30th, 1893, and the small Becca congregation finally had a place to call home. After N.J. Holmes organized the church in 1891, Reverend W. L. Boggs accepted the call of the church to become its first minister. In the first 20 years of the church's history, 5 ministers served the church. Reverend N.J. Holmes, who helped organize the congregation, Reverend W. L. Boggs, 1891 to 1897, Reverend A. H. Atkins, 1898 through 1901, Reverend C. A. B. Jennings, 1902 through 1908, Reverend C. B. Yergin, 1909 until 1910. Sometime during those first 20 years, the community of Becca was renamed Roebuck after Colonel Benjamin Roebuck, who served during the Revolutionary War. The exact year the name changed from Becca to Roebuck is unclear. This 1886 map shows the community labeled as Becca, and the church's original land deed from 1893 references the name still as Becca. But a copy of this 1910 Spartanburg County map shows the name already appeared as Roebuck. Sometime between these years, the name had changed, and the church's name presumably changed around that same time. During those early years, the congregation began to grow and more space was needed. It is not known when the first wing of Sunday school rooms were added, but this photograph shows the building in the early 1900s, not long after that addition was completed. The church building originally consisted of just a one-room sanctuary, with 2 smaller rooms at the front of the building on either side of the front doors. The metal support poles that exist today are at the corner of where those small rooms once were, with the entrance foyer in between, stepping up into the sanctuary. The inside of the church building was wooden clapboard walls with beadboard ceiling and hardwood floors. Standing in the middle of the sanctuary was a single cast iron heating stove that still remains here at the church. Our history shows that during the years of 1911 to 1913, new pews were purchased at a cost of $300. This is one of the pews that were installed in those early years. Over the next 11 years, 7 ministers served our church. Reverend L. W. Brown, 1911 through 1913, Reverend W. J. Roach, and Reverend S. L. Wilson during 1913, Reverend A. H. Griffith in 1914, Reverend J. F. Ligon, 1915 to 1919, Reverend T. A. Beckett for the year of 1919, and Reverend T. D. Johnston, 1920 through 1922. During Reverend Johnston's time, the church took on new spiritual life, and 13 new members joined by transfer or reconsecration. Also of note, in 1920, the modern convenience of electricity was added, and new electric lights were installed at a cost of $250. Here is one of those original chandeliers. Beginning in 1923, the next minister to answer the call of the pastorate was Reverend R. M. Phillips. Reverend Phillips served the church off and on from 1923 until 1947. Unfortunately, the church records have been lost for the years of 1924 through 1943, so the history during this time is sketchy. During those years, 2 other pastors served the church with Reverend Phillips. Reverend John D. Henderson was a minister for several years and is known to have served in 1930. Reverend Kagan also served some years during this time. Reverend Henderson held morning services at 2nd Presbyterian Church in Spartanburg, and then held services at Roebuck at 2:30 in the afternoon. In 1943, Reverend Phillips was again at the church, and in 1944 was called to be the full-time minister. During his time in our church, Reverend Phillips also pastored Center Point and Glen Spring Presbyterian churches. At this time, the church membership had grown to 87, with 7 elders and 7 deacons. One gift of note to the church that could not be found in the records was that of the church bell. Hanging in the steeple is a brass bell acquired by H. B. Foster. Mr. Foster served as deacon and later elder at the church during the 20s and 30s, and was a longtime railroad employee. The bell came from a Charleston and Western Carolina Railway engine that traveled the tracks in the area. Another interesting fact about the C and WC Railroad is that a spur track beginning at the depot in Becca, running to Glen Springs, opened in 1894 and ran directly in front of the church along Highway 215. This train traveled the narrow gauge track, carrying passengers to the Glen Springs Hotel for almost 20 years, ceasing operations sometime around World War I. It is possible that this bell could have come from that engine, since it was acquired by H. B. Foster sometime after the railroad ended. However, there are no records that would support this theory. The church continued to grow, and by 1947 the membership had reached 100. Also during that year, an additional half-acre of land was purchased for $200 from the Rogers family. By the end of 1947, Reverend Phillips had accepted a pastorate call to Erwin, North Carolina, and Reverend Joe Wagner became our supply pastor. During this time, more space was needed, and a wooden addition was added to the back of the church building. No pictures exist of the building, but the entrance was through a double doorway behind the pulpit. The building contained 4 classrooms, 2 on an upper level and 2 on the lower level. The nursery had been housed in the small room on the right as you entered the church sanctuary, but was moved to one of the new downstairs rooms, doubling its size. In 1949, plans were discussed for building a manse for the church, and by December of that year, a fund was started to collect for the building project. 6 pastors served over the next few years. Reverend Joe Wagner, who was a ministerial student, supplied the church from 1947 until 1951, and left to take a full-time position at Tryon Presbyterian. Mr. Ed Wilson, 1951. 2 more ministerial students, Mr. Ben Collins, 1951 until 1952, and Mr. M.C. McDonald, 1952 until 1953. The Reverend A. Morrill Keith served in 1953, and Reverend P.S. McChesney, a retired minister, served from 1953 until 1954. In 1953, a planning committee was formed to build During the next 11 years, 2 pastors served our church. Reverend Herschel Longenecker, 1954 until 1956, and Reverend W. H. Dindy, 1956 until 1965. Reverend Longenecker was a missionary to Africa in the Belgian Congo for 33 years and wrote a book about his life entitled Memories of Congo. Shortly before Reverend Dindy came in 1956, the young matrons class had taken on another project to install new stained glass windows. Funds were established shortly thereafter, with the Switzer family giving many of the windows. During Reverend Dindy's time, the need was felt for a fellowship hall. In 1958, construction began and by October was completed. In 1960, the church was remodeled. The 2 small rooms next to the front doors were removed. The floor was raised to the level of the sanctuary, and a new entrance foyer was added to the front of the building. Also during the remodeling, the wood exterior was covered with brick, and new stained glass windows were installed. By 1966, membership had risen to 125, and more space was needed. In 1967, plans were begun for the addition of a new Sunday school building, replacing the 4-room building behind the church. A building committee was chosen, and in August of 1968, construction began. Pictured here are Reverend Neese and breaking ground one of the oldest members at the time, Sam Switzer. Standing behind is the building committee made up of Hugh Carswell, Andrew Hughes, Ben Maccabee, building committee chairman, Pat Montgomery, Bill O'Kelly, and Paul Sumner Sr. The 10-room addition was completed at a cost of $32,000. During this time and over the next 20 years, 3 pastors served our church. Reverend R.D. Neese, 1966 until 1968. Reverend John W. Jameson, 1969 until 1973. And Reverend Fred D. Thompson, 1973 until 1986. One significant event in our church's history happened in July 1973. With changes being made in the Presbyterian Church of the U.S., a vote was taken and passed for our church to withdraw from the Presbyterian Church of the U.S. to join the newly formed Presbyterian Church in America. While the church's exterior had major changes in recent years with new additions and brick facade, little had changed to the original interior of the sanctuary since its construction in 1893. So in March of 1974, a complete remodeling was begun, updating the interior with sheetrock walls and ceiling, carpeted floors, and new electrical service with modern chandeliers. The raised pulpit area was also enlarged, and more space added for a choir loft and future organ. 2 additions came in 1975 with the purchase of an organ and a wooden cross covered in gold leaf hung behind the pulpit. Church records show that by 1979, membership had increased to 152. With the church continuing to grow, more land was purchased in 1979. Almost 2.5 acres were purchased, which included tracts of land behind the church and the lot to the right side, which included a house. This house was later moved in the mid-1980s. Over the next 10 years, 2 pastors served our church. Reverend Cleet Hucks, 1987 until 1990, and Dr. David White, 1991 through 1996. In preparation for the 100th anniversary in 1991, the Fellowship Hall underwent renovations. Until that time, the building had remained as it was since 1958. New carpet was installed over the old tile floors. New lighting was installed, along with a new ceiling, and the entire building was painted. Throughout 1997 and into 1998, the church was without a pastor. However, during this time, we were able to welcome back to the pulpit as a retired pastor, Reverend Joe Wagner, who had ministered to us almost 50 years earlier. Also supplying us during this time were Reverend Jack Gettings, Reverend Carl Sorensen, and Reverend Carl Story. 23 years have passed since the church's interior was remodeled, and the Sunday school building still remained as it had been built almost 30 years earlier. So in 1997, another major renovation occurred. Floor repairs were made, and the raised pulpit area was again enlarged. New carpeting was installed throughout the sanctuary and Sunday school buildings. New tile floors were installed on the stairways and lower level, and all bathrooms were replaced with new fixtures and lighting. Three more pastors have supplied the church since that time. Reverend Lee Mosley, 1998 through 2004. Reverend J. Ray Bobo, 2005 until 2015. And our current pastor, Reverend Richard Winston, who accepted the call in September 2015. Over the last 10 years, smaller renovations and improvements have occurred, including Fellowship Hall renovations in 2002, adding new windows and siding, new windows in the Sunday school building in 2014, a new organ installed in 2015, and kitchen renovations and painting in the Fellowship Hall in 2016. Our current project is the replacement of the sanctuary stained glass windows, which have been in place since 1960. Along with the church's fruitful ministry over the last 125 years, we can't overlook the work of various church programs. One of the oldest is that of the Women in the Church. It was first organized in the same year the church started, 1891, by Mrs. D.C. Strobel, and upon her death taken up by Mrs. E.F. Parker. The women in the church have always been vital to the church's growth and community. During World War II, they made and rolled bandages for the soldiers. Another program is that of Sunday School, which has been an essential part of the church's growth. It is not known when it first started, but records show that it has been a part of the church for more than 70 years. Vacation Bible School is yet another program that couldn't go unnoticed. It has been held each summer since at least 1955, as shown in some of these photographs from those early years. With the blessings that have been bestowed on us during the rich history that has made up Roebuck Presbyterian's last 125 years, one can only look forward with excitement to find what God has in store for our congregation, enabling us to carry out His Word over the next 125 years.